I've been following the Nerdzoic YouTube channel for at least a half decade, so when Big Nerdy himself reached out to me to commission a diorama, I was thrilled. I was even more excited when I found out that he wanted to commission something I had never made before, a toy store. But this wasn't going to be just any toy store. It was meant to be the Nerdzoic Toy Store. This is the story of how I made his vision a reality. Before we get into the build, here's a look at the 3D render of this diorama layout. When fully assembled, this diorama is going to be 24 inches wide by 18 inches deep and 11 inches tall. And if you're wondering, these dimensions are built to fit this specific posing table in the Nerdzoic studio. Like most of my projects, this one started with some 1-inch XPS foam that I cut to size using this Proxxon hot wire cutting table, starting with the 90-degree angled sides and then the 45-ish degree angled sides for the front door portion of the building, which is helped by the Proxxon foot pedal accessory that allows me to operate the heat output hands-free. It turned out that one of my measurements was an inch off, so I hot glued on an extra inch of foam that I'll sure up later in the build. And after a dry fit, I needed to permanently bond that angled door portion to the front wall of the diorama, which I did with this trusty hot wire foam factory styro glue. This stuff was specifically created to bond XPS foam pieces together. And once that cured, it was time to magnetize the diorama using these Ampro ceramic magnets, 18 of them to be exact. Starting with the small base, I use a copper tube to puncture the surface of the foam in the spots where I want to install the magnets. Then I use a box cutter to cut out the bottom area where the magnets will sit. Apply a little hot glue and stick my magnets in place. The next step is to indent the walls where I need to install my magnets and then repeat the process I just showed to install the coinciding magnets. Once the back wall was in place, I used that as my anchor and magnetized the two side walls to the base and then to the back wall. Last up was the front wall, which was the most complicated because of the angled wall segments. And the final thing for this step was to install the diorama base magnets that were too far away from the edge to install with a box cutter. For these ones, I opted to mask up for safety, turn on a fan, and use a wood burning tool to melt away spaces for my magnets to exist. You don't want to breathe in the fumes that this process creates, so please be safe. And with that, we're fully magnetized. Notice how strong of a hold these magnets provide. They're the best I've ever used. This diorama is going to have a large window area on the front wall and a functional hinge door on the angled wall, so I mark where I plan to install those with a Sharpie. First, I cut the vertical door frame lines with the Proxxon to ensure a perfect 90-degree door frame, and then cut the top part of the door frame horizontally with a utility knife. Second was the window area that was so big I had to combine two 3D printed window frames for the area, which I used to measure where my cuts would occur. The key to cutting this area was to first use a sharp X-Acto to define my cut lines with multiple passes, and then switch to a utility knife for several more smooth passes through the XPS. When I felt I was close to cutting through to the other side, I reoriented the foam and used the utility knife with a sawing motion to complete things. Things were looking good after a dry fit of the window and door frame, so I turned to fixing some imperfections in the foam. I often buy 4-foot by 8-foot sheets of this foam at Home Depot. The plus side is that I get a lot of foam at a single time, but the downside is the large sheets of foam always have these unsightly scoring lines in them. The good news is I can easily cover these up by filling them in with lightweight wall spackle. But there's still a major structural problem with this diorama. This portion here is way too fragile because of how close the window is to the edge of the foam. This is not ideal, but it is fixable. I'll need to cut an inch off the sidewall and attach it to the front wall to stabilize the window frame. Once the glue sets, I cover up the seams with some more wall spackle. Now it's time to start doing some of the detail work, starting with carving out the brick wall. I start by cutting the horizontal lines first and then move on to the vertical lines using a T-square. Then I use a clay sculpting tool to indent the brick lines, but this time I do the vertical lines followed by the horizontal ones, which helps give a clean finished look to my brick lines. One of the best ways to texture foam is to use a rolled up ball of tinfoil. I used this on my brick walls and then turned to my base to carve some sidewalk segments using my X-Acto blade. After those were carved, I went back to the tinfoil ball, but this time I used it on the area of my base that is meant to represent the sidewalk. I wanted to add some dimension to the front facade of the building, so I added a thin trim piece on the bottom and a thicker piece using the same process along the top of the diorama exterior. Once the glue set, I used the wall spackle to fill in the gaps between the layers of foam. The interior portions of the side walls are going to have a cinder block look, so I used the same approach I did for the brick wall, but I made sure to adjust the size to emulate a cinder block size at 1/12 scale. I'm going to be using a technique that I learned from Small World Workshop to texture my walls. But first I needed to prime the walls black, and while I was at it, I painted the diorama base exterior gray. Once the paint was dry, I covered the surface with matte Mod Podge, filled up a plastic cup with mortar mix, and covered it with one of my wife's old stockings to ensure only the finest grains would adhere to the piece. Then I used a shaking motion across the whole surface area. Next, I soaked the mortar mix with isopropyl alcohol and then watered down water Mod Podge solution that I pressed in using a foam brush. This process will lock all the mortar mix in place once it dries, making for a convincing stucco-like look. While I waited for that to dry, I turned my attention to the interior floor, which I planned to be a faux hardwood. Using the Proxxon, I cut all of my beams to size. Off camera, I trimmed them down to 3 different lengths so I could create a staggered board floor. I spread hot wire foam factory styro goo across the work area and then placed the boards down, starting in the corner to ensure my boards would be flush against the back and side walls. As I approached the front, I also put the front wall in place to help guide my floorboard install. There was some overhang that I needed to trim, so I broke the T-square back out to make sure I had a nice 90-degree angle to cut against. I also used the T-square as a straight edge to make a clean cut where the door threshold needed to be. Next up, I textured my floorboards using a wire brush and some water. Soaking the wire brush in the water before brushing the foam prevents tears. I learned that from my good friend Terrafoamer. Then I did several coats of Anita's Rivera Tan acrylic paint on the wood area. I also used this time to apply washes to the sidewalk area, first using a dropper bottle and paper towel to dab on the wash, and then a paintbrush and some brown washes in the concrete segment gap areas. To give the floor a more realistic wood look, I applied Minwax wood stain using a paintbrush. When I was doing this, I purposefully did an uneven coat to add some variation to the look of the wood floor. Then I let this dry for about 24 hours and turned my attention back to the walls. I used Rust-Oleum Slate Gray to prime the piece and then a lighter gray sprayed from above to apply a Zenithal Highlight to it. This simulates a sunlight effect, casting shadows and highlights on the piece. Ultimately, it adds to the realism of the diorama. I did the same thing to the cinder block and brick walls, but made sure I applied a Mod Podge and paint mix to them before spray painting to ensure the foam wasn't destroyed in the process. Then I applied an uneven coat of brick red spray paint to the brick wall. When that dried, I applied some Minwax polyurethane spray to the brick and cinder block walls, which allows me to apply lightweight wall spackle in between the brick gaps to create a diorama mortar effect on those walls with minimal paint loss. I just apply with a straight edge, scraping away the excess spackle, and then use a microfiber cloth dipped in water to wipe away the remaining excess. But the spackle is white and looks way too new, so I spritz on some black wash and then dab it up with a paper towel to tone down the mortar color and add variation to the walls. I wanted the exterior parts of these walls to have a light tan look, so I spray painted these outside. Okay, let's take a break from painting to install a functional logoed sign in this brick wall. I got this kit on Amazon. It came with a roll of battery powered LED strip lights and a remote control that has 8 different light settings. Big Nerdy sent over his logo, so I sized it up in Microsoft Word and printed it out on some photo paper using my inkjet printer. Then I cut the paper to size using an X-Acto and paired it up with this 3D printed light box that I designed for this project. The light box was designed to be used with these specific cuttable LEDs with an area to feed the wire out the back to connect to the battery housing. These LEDs have an adhesive on the back side of them, so I stuck them in place with those first, but they weren't strong enough to maintain the hold. So I super glued them in place and then put clear packing tape over top to ensure they would stay put without affecting the light. The light box was originally designed to sit on top of the brick wall, but Big Nerdy and I thought it would look better if we inserted it into the wall. So I traced the areas I needed to cut and then sliced up the foam and pushed out the portion of the brick that I no longer needed. Then I slipped the brick wall over the light box and it fit nice and snug. Before doing anything else, I made sure the light was still functional. I wanted to diffuse the light as much as possible, so I installed another 3D printed part to create more space between the light source and the logo. I glued that down and then a sheet of clear acrylic, the logoed photo paper, and finally a nice trim piece to make this flush with the brick wall. I turned my attention back to the other walls, adding washes to the exterior portions to act as light, wind, and water weathering. And then it was time to install the large front window in the diorama. I used the window frames to trace my cut on some clear acrylic. Then I hand cut the acrylic using an acrylic cutting knife. The key to this was doing a lot of passes in a slow and controlled fashion until I had clean cuts. If you go too fast or try to snap the cuts off, you can get cracking, which I wanted to avoid. I hit the window frames with a light dusting of spray paint to dirty them up and then glued them onto the acrylic with some clear Gorilla Glue. This is my favorite glue for applying window frames to windows as it does not smudge. To make sure the frame stayed aligned with the windows, I taped them down to some cardboard while the glue dried. I applied that same super glue to the window cutout using some scrap foam and popped the window into place, which thankfully fit very snug in place. This build took me about 7 weeks to finish, and during that time I decided to upgrade my workshop with my first ever resin printer, the Elegoo Saturn 4 Ultra. This was something I was wanting to do for a while and was able to do because of the support of my patrons. So huge shout out to them. Thank you all. And I immediately put that printer to use printing these accessories for the Nerdzoic Toy Store. But I didn't print everything with the new printer. I used my Ender 3s to print this functional hinge door and door frame, which I spray painted silver and inserted a piece of acrylic into. That said, the door handle was resin printed. Painting the other resin printed items was so much fun. I primed them and then spray painted them before adding some weathering with a simple dry brushing technique. When I was satisfied, I used the styro glue to glue them onto one of the exterior walls. These door threshold pieces were also resin printed. I designed them so I could use sewing needles to help secure them after gluing them in place. I started by placing the threshold on the inside, then I glued the door into place before placing the exterior threshold piece to complete the door area. For fun, I added in some posters that I thought Matt would really enjoy. These are just held up with double-sided tape. I really felt like I needed an attractive exterior sign for above the door frame, so I printed one and painted it up using a combination of spray paint to prime it and apply a base coat before hand painting it. I used Vallejo dark blue on the top lettering and then some white acrylic on the bottom portion. And because I was impatient, I borrowed my wife's hairdryer to dry the paint in between coats. I think I did about 3 or 4 coats on each row to ensure a professional looking paint job. I tried using the styro glue and hot glue to install this sign, but it didn't take. So I turned back to the Gorilla Glue and rigged it so it could dry flat. I let that set for 2 hours. Then I installed some 3D printed shelving units to the back wall. Big Nerdy already has some standing shelving units for his store floor, so I didn't need to make any as part of this commission. Nevertheless, I wanted him to have somewhere to place some different things for the store. Matt wanted this diorama for a number of reasons, like for toy photography and for display, but he also wanted to be able to showcase all the awesome brands that he offers at the Nerdzoic Toy Store. And if you're not familiar, Nerdzoic Toy Store is an online retailer that offers a wide variety of the most popular action figure brands out on the market. It's a great place to find brands like Hasbro, Bandai, Diamond Select, Hiya Toys, Mattel, McFarlane, NECA, Mafex, Super 7, and so much more. So head over to www.nerdzoic.com. I really want to thank Matt, aka Big Nerdy, aka Nerdzoic, for entrusting me with this diorama. I hope that you enjoy messing around with this and using this for your purposes as much as I did creating this and playing around with it after it was finished. I'd also like to thank you, the audience, for sticking around and watching me create this diorama. If you like what you saw, I hope that you'll like the video and subscribe to the channel so you can see more epic diorama builds like this one.
VASCO Toys. Action figure dioramas and props.